Here are your hosts, Kyle, Fellows, and Andrew Mertig. This is the Draft Fellows Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 17 of the Draft Fellows Podcast. I am Andrew Mertig. That's Kyle Fellows. Together, we are the Draft Fellows. Make sure you follow our channel on YouTube, or you can check out the audio version on your favorite podcasting platform. Today, we are finally flipping the page from the 2024 NFL Draft class to the 2025 NFL Draft prospects. And obviously, a lot is going to change in the coming months. If you look back 12 months ago, there's a ton of change in who was listed as premier prospects for 2024. But I think this is going to give us a great launching point to start this conversation, which of course is going to go on for the next 10 months or more. But before we jump into the prospects, Kyle, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing really well. You know, football is back. We have the Hall of Fame game on our TVs as we record this tonight. We're recording on a Thursday. I don't know when this episode is going to drop, but we have Bears Texans on TV. I really, it's hard to get pumped. I mean, preseason, I love preseason football, but this Hall of Fame game, they don't have a lot of starters out there, those kinds of things. But I really did want to tune in just to see this new kickoff rules and those kinds of things. But every time I looked away was when the kickoff happened. So I actually didn't really get to see much of that. But football's back. We're here. We hit August, and it's just exciting to know that it's going to be on our TVs kind of from now until middle of the winter. So it's a good feeling.
Yeah, super excited. We, of course, got held over by the Hard Knocks offseason with the New York Giants. So anything that you want to share about that?
Yeah, I know we both have had a chance to kind of take this in, and they made this show for us, right? Like, we're the nerds that care about this, and obviously a lot of people have enjoyed this version of Hard Knocks. But Andrew, like, I know we're through it. We've seen all 5 episodes. And I mean, what are your thoughts on what the Giants did this offseason? They've kind of gotten a lot of flack for the way that they kind of handled some of the Saquon stuff. And obviously the Giants have a little bit of influence on what content makes it to the show. So that's fascinating what they were willing to show. And there were some reports on Twitter this week that the Giants were actually willing to pay Josh Jacobs upwards of $4 million more than the offer he got with the Green Bay Packers. So, like, what are your thoughts? Like, did that happen? Like, do you think that the Giants kind of fumbled with the whole Saquon situation, or like, how did you feel about all that?
Yeah, it's interesting. They seem to really miscalculate the market on Saquon Barkley. All of the talk that they had seemed that they thought he was going to come back at a sort of average value running back contract, right? Like, because running backs had no market, at least last offseason, maybe even the previous 2. And so they thought, like, well, Saquon's not going to have a market. But then the cap shoots up. They sort of miscalculated what was going to happen. The Eagles swoop in. They weren't anywhere near willing to match his offer. And I do think, like, yeah, you could look at this and say, well, they got Devin Singletary on a bargaining contract compared to what they paid Saquon. And that extra money allowed them to go out and get Brian Burns, which is really, really impactful. But also, they lost their identity on offense in what is going to be a very, very important year for Daniel Jones.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just going to be fascinating. It's so hard. Like, Joe Shane has kind of gotten some flack as like he's the young guy, and sometimes it kind of feels like maybe the owner is the one kind of like pulling the strings and some of those difficulties. But like, he seems to have a pretty good understanding that like you can't empty the bank on a running back. Like, that's probably not great team building process. So it's just hard for me to believe that like the Josh Jacobs rumor is like true just because of that. Like, I think if they were going to overpay, they were probably going to pay their guy. It just, you don't get that vibe. Obviously, they can edit what they want to show us, but that's kind of hard for me. That feels like something coming from an agent more than something that actually happened with maybe the Giants. But
I think there was a missing piece to like something that was edited out, because I think that they probably were more interested in a quarterback than what they let on based on the meetings, based on how they were sort of poking around trade conversations. I think there probably was more to it than that. I think their owner probably was not willing to allow a GM who is very much on a hot seat to trade a bunch of future draft capital for their guy and then potentially have to replace everybody this offseason and then bring in a GM and a coach who don't have the opportunity to get their guy. So that part is interesting to me. I don't know who they would have traded up with because it seemed the Patriots weren't willing to move, but that part is really, really interesting to see. Like, hey, they're just like us, they're making their dynasty fantasy football trade offers, getting rejected just like the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly. It does feel that way. And we did get a little bit of a glimpse that so Drake May was someone that it felt like they really liked in some of the interviews. And then we actually Twitter, someone shared that there was a board that was leaked and they had a lot of their guys. And Drake May was one of the guys that they had marked as blue, which is team leader and high character guys. And he was very near the top of the board. It's hard to imagine that you put those things together and there seemed to be a little bit of just an acceptance that had to take place when they realized that Drake May was not going to be in the cards. And that's when we kind of got the pivot to okay, we hope that Neighbors is there, but it really did feel like maybe they were going to go Drake May, and this was going to be a very different conversation at the quarterback position. So yeah, like you said, we've all been there. If you play fantasy football, sometimes you just can't get to your guy, and then you've got to have plan B. And it's really kind of what we felt there. And then in the second round, Andrew, I thought it was super interesting. They let us see the disappointment with the corners, right? McKinstry, they wanted McKinstry and Lassiter super bad. And for whatever reason, they weren't willing to trade up for one of those guys, which I'm if they thought McKinstry especially was going to get to where they were picking, that felt kind of like a fool's errand. But we saw that disappointment, and then how an NFL team had to pivot kind of in their thinking, which I felt was kind of strange that they were that fluid in their process at that point with what they were going to do in the second round. So that was fascinating.
Am I mistaken? Did they trade down in the second?
I don't remember them trading down.
So there was part of the episode, specifically after the first round pick, that I zoned out for a second because I was doing something else. And I thought they were talking about how they had very little draft capital.
Oh.
And so they traded down in the second, which would make sense because they picked Newbin right before the Packers, or right after the Packers picked.
Yeah.
Because Edgerrin Cooper went. And then, so I think that would have been lower than what they were originally picked. So to your point, that's where I was going with that. It's so interesting. They're really in love with these two corners.
Yeah.
But they trade down anyways because we just need more draft capital.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they both go. It's interesting.
Yeah, I was curious because McKinstry, they kind of it felt like they kind of expected okay, he's still on the board, and then he's not. And then it was the guy at the back table who's this is going to be Lassiter, and they're oh crap, that was kind of the consolation prize that we thought was going to be there. And then they kind of did the whole thing where they ended up with Newbin. So just fascinating. I'm not saying that the Giants bad process or anything like that, but just it is so interesting to get a peek into an NFL team where they have to make these decisions. And it really is they have 10 minutes on the clock and they've got to make it all come together, and they've got to get everybody on the same page. So really fascinating to see how it works, but really enjoyed that series. And I hope that HBO continues to crank out those off-season, versions of Hard Knocks, because I think it's maybe even more fascinating than the ones that they give us through training camp.
For sure. So back to the content of the show, we are talking 2025 prospects, and this is really just meant to be a high-level overview. Of course, we know that there's going to be players who drop off this board, maybe don't even declare for the draft at the end of the year. And then there's going to be players that come out of absolutely nowhere. But these are the top of the board offensive players that we know of currently. And we're going to start where the draft always starts, and that is quarterbacks. And right now there's 5 names that are sort of circling the top of draft boards. Some people like some more than others. Maybe there's some names that we're not mentioning here that you'd like to see. But basically what we're hearing, Carson Beck out of Georgia, Jalen Milroe out of Alabama, Shedeur Sanders from Colorado, Drew Allar from Penn State, and Quinn Ewers from Texas. So Kyle, any of those names jump out to you right now?
No, so Carson Beck is really interesting to me, and obviously a lot has to change over the course of the year. But I think he's the guy to watch. Does he take a big step forward? Because coming into last year, he kind of had to hold off a couple other guys. And so he was kind of looking over his shoulder. That's not the case this year. He knows that it's his job. And I think that this is a player that had a good year last year and maybe exceeded some expectations. But I think that the ascent is certainly possible. And we could be talking about him as maybe the clear quarterback one, maybe by a significant margin by the end of the process. Kind of a traditional pocket passer, but not afraid to take off and run with it. Throws it with plenty of zip. The accuracy is also pretty good. So I think he's a candidate to be the clear quarterback one by the end of the process. And playing for a quarterback or a team like Georgia, I think that he's a quarterback that we could definitely see ascend through the process.
Yeah, and I will say really quick before I jump on a different name is I was wrong. The Giants traded their original second-round pick to the Panthers in the Brian Burns trade. And
yes.
They were actually picking the Seahawks pick at 47 from the Leonard Williams trade.
Very good. That's right. Yep.
That's why I was confused that they were picking around the Packers. Anyways, so I wanted to talk the one player that I think has the potential to like leap up draft boards, and we see this every year. I think Drew Aller from Penn State is like all tools.
Yep.
I think I always get nervous with anybody who's playing for James Franklin, but because oftentimes Penn State players are so much better pros than they were college players, because I think they do a great job of recruiting and not such a great job of developing. But I think Aller has a chance to really ascend from like a guy who has a lot of potential to be a top pick into somebody who could legitimately be a top 5 player in this class. I'm not saying it does happen, but I think of all of the players on the list, the chance to ascend the highest is probably his.
Yeah. He's the prototype, right? Like 6'4", 235, 240 pounds, 5-star recruit. So he has all that pedigree. And this just kind of feels like that guy that the NFL circles are going to want to be good, right? Some of those guys, they get pushed up when they're like, they have that big frame. And so it feels like he might be that guy this year. 2023 wasn't perfect, and I think he kind of underperformed what the hopes were. But again, Penn State, some of those issues with the offense, there's definitely a lot of hope that he can take the step forward into this year and be a better player in 2024. Andrew, Quinn Ewers is on this list. And this is a player that like people have been talking about taking high for a couple of draft cycles. Like that this guy might be a top 3 pick, in the draft a couple times. Like we've heard this, that like, he's going to go at least top 10. Like this is someone that the NFL might like. What do you think of Quinn Ewers, and what should we expect going into this season?
This is what I'll say. If Quinn Ewers was any good at all last year, Texas would have won the national championship.
Yeah.
You cannot surround a player with more talent than what he had.
Exactly.
And he was just bad. And now, okay, let me pause here for a second. Bo Nix had a lot of bad tape before going to Oregon, right? Yep. And he turned it around. And I think, you can go back in history and find lots of examples of this. This doesn't mean that Quinn Ewers won't be good this year. I think in college, oftentimes it takes time to develop. Ewers is one of those interesting cases. He was a super, super highly ranked recruit coming out of high school. He gets $1 million to go to Ohio State. He then doesn't play at all, transfers to Texas, is the heir apparent, and comes out and is kind of like not that great. He's holding up Arch Manning, and but just continues to be the guy there. So we'll see. Maybe that development does happen this year. If he was in the draft currently, he would not be a first, second, maybe he'd be a 3rd round pick. But this whole season is there to develop. And the one thing that I will not do with quarterbacks is give up too soon in their college career.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating. A lot of times you do see like the transfer that's necessary at the quarterback position. Like you would see like Arch Manning go somewhere else, or you would see Quinn Ewers go somewhere else. But like these guys just seem like entrenched there, that this is going to be the way that it's going to be. And I do just wonder, like, is there a place, like, would Arch have a chance to play this year? And like, could that totally submarine Quinn Ewers, who like a lot of people think still has a chance to go in the first round if he plays well? Like, could he go from being a first round pick to being a player who doesn't even start for the final year of like his college career with the Longhorns? Like, I don't know, like if that's possible, but you mentioned it, like the accuracy, the inconsistency, it's all there. It's all stuff he's got to work out. And now he doesn't have A.D. Mitchell. He doesn't have Xavier Worthy. He lost Jonathan Brooks. Jatavian Sanders isn't there. So it's just hard to see it going better, but it's still within the range of outcomes. So we'll just have to see. But yeah, Quinn Ewers is going to be a fascinating one to watch there at Texas.
Yeah, and I just can I say something about Shadur Sanders before we move on? I know we're going kind of long. So for me, I dislike Deion Sanders quite a bit. I think he is like, he's not a good football coach. He's an excellent recruiter. I think he's really good at branding himself. I do think NFL teams are going to take Deion's involvement as an off the field issue, and they're going to hold it against him. And that is not fair. Shadur did not necessarily do anything to deserve that critique. But I mean, when your father / coach is in the media talking about how you're only going to play for certain teams, that can have a really negative impact.
It's tough.
And yeah, and I don't necessarily think what we've seen shows me a first round quarterback yet. Now, last year, Colorado's offensive line was a disaster. And that's part of the problem with Deion, right? Like, he came into this situation and talked a big game, and he didn't have the foundation of the team set up. Now, they will be better this year. How much better is yet to be seen. And I think that's where we see it is Shadur just a guy who has a phenomenal NFL caliber arm and doesn't have the rest of this stuff, right? Like, obviously he's a fantastic athlete. He's really good with his feet, but like, does he have the presence to sit in the pocket and deliver throws? We've seen that at times, but it's been wildly inconsistent. I'd like to see his footwork cleaned up. I'd like to see him read defenses better, not just throw to Travis Hunter over and over and over. I'd like to see all of those things. But like, will we? I don't know. Yeah. And then like, that makes me really nervous. Like, is this a guy that's going to be coming in the NFL where we know very little about him? And then does he fall into, you know, maybe the late first round because there's tons of upside, but lots of inconsistencies? And then, you know, how does that impact his play? I think his coach is not doing him a lot of favors.
And I think one thing that's really interesting is like, I want to say it was Daniel Jeremiah, but don't hold me to that because it's been like, I don't know, 6 months since I saw this. But I think coming out of the last cycle, I think it was Daniel Jeremiah said, hey, like, I really like Shadur Sanders. I think he brings a lot. I think he can have success in the NFL. And then he said, my comp for him is Geno Smith. And I feel like there's so much hype around Shadur Sanders, and then you throw out, you know, the praise, and then you couple it and join it to a pro profile like Geno Smith, and people are like, oh, that kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But I just think it's important. Like, you can like a prospect, you just have to put him in the right bucket, right? Like, you can't pretend that he's something that he's not. So I thought it was cool that DJ said, like, I like this guy, I just have to think about him in the terms of what he actually is. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how NFL teams view him throughout the process, and if they view him as like a player that can be a top 5 pick, or like you said, maybe he drifts down to like the late first, early second, where, you know, there's some development and a different kind of skill set that you need to nurture to pull the best out of him. But fascinating. I don't know that this is a great quarterback class, but I think it will be a fascinating quarterback class to watch develop.
Yeah, and I think right now there's a lot of people that I trust their opinions that are saying, and the NFL is not viewing this as a very good quarterback class. And most teams are thinking like, well, we either need to, you know, maybe luck into somebody shooting up the boards like a Joe Burrow ascension, Maybe that's Carson Beck.
Mm-hmm.
Or we need to wait another year on quarterbacks.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. So we wanted to jump next into skill players. So running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. And of course, this is another position where there's going to be a lot of change as we move forward into the draft process. But is there a running back you want to start with, Kyle?
This is a really interesting group because I think we went from having Bijan Robinson, a couple cycles ago, to this last year kind of being like, I don't know who's the guy. Like, there's a lot of good players, not great players. I think we might have a really, really good class year, and I haven't gotten to get too far into Ollie Gordon or Ashton Gentry. I've seen them a little bit, and there's a lot to be excited about. For me, Travion Henderson is a fascinating case because this is a player who could have come out last year, and everybody thought was going to come out last year, but he didn't. And like, there was a lot of people who were like, why? Like, why didn't he come out in a weaker draft class? And there were some reasons, like maybe, some health things, durability concerns that he would have said, like, I'm going to wait, but he doesn't. And then Quinshon Judkins joins Ohio State and comes over as a transfer. And so I thought it was really interesting. I saw an interview with Travion Henderson where he talks about how he kind of had to like work through some emotions of what that was like, some jealousy and, frustration for like, okay, I was the guy and now I have to share this spot with Judkins, who's like an incredible prospect in his own right. And so, last year he has a nagging injury. 2022 was a foot injury and then undisclosed injury in 2023. So Henderson hasn't really been able to be healthy all the way through, but super explosive athlete who has great long speed. So I'm really curious to see how Ohio State plays these guys. But for me, it was cool to hear that interview for Henderson to say, hey, it took me a minute, but then kind of to be humble enough to say, we're going to be a great 1-2 punch and just kind of like let the chips fall where they may. But for you and I, that doesn't really resolve the tension here that could be with, between him and Judkins in this process. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and there's lots of examples throughout the years of two NFL caliber running backs in the same backfield and how that ends up working out. Recently you have Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson in Texas. I can think back to some of the Wisconsin backfields. They had Melvin Gordon and James White at the same time.
Yeah.
You can go back to even as far back as like Darren McFadden and Felix Jones.
Uh-huh.
And typically the way it works out is even if they're seen as relatively similar in college, one tends to separate from the other. So it's going to be fascinating to see, like, is there that separation? Does the NFL kind of just say, well, we can only gauge so much from your college tape because you're splitting carries. So we're going to judge you more on what we see in, the all-star games or go back to earlier seasons and stuff. So that part is fascinating because you don't always get these top prospects from the same school.
Yeah, you don't. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out for sure. But it will be fun to have a loaded running back class again. But I mean, this year we were spoiled with a wide receiver class that was, I don't want to say historic, but might have been like historic, like a really, really good wide receiver class. Andrew, what do we think of this class? Have we heard, like, is this going to be another talented group, or should we kind of maybe temper expectations relative to what we had in 2023?
Yeah, right now, I don't know if there is like that real top end wide receiver. I have not done the work on Luther Burden III from Missouri yet. So he's the guy whose name is kind of creeping into the top of mock drafts. Doesn't really mean anything at this time of year, but I think the perception is he may be the top player. So I don't know. Do you have anything on Burden?
No, not on Burden. I'm with you. Like, I've kind of put a bookmark to watch him next because he's getting so much buzz. But for me, it's like Emeka Egbuka is the player, kind of similar to Henderson. I mean, this is two Ohio State guys. It's kind of on accident that I'm highlighting here. But Egbuka was one of my favorite players in last year's cycle because we thought he was going to come out with his teammate, Marvin Harrison. And like I said, I liked Emeka a lot, but last year's class was so stacked that he just kind of kept drifting further and further down my wide receiver ranks as I worked through more players. And 2023 wasn't his best year. He had an ankle injury that forced you to kind of go back to his 2022 tape to really get a feel for what he can be. And so I think wisely, he probably came back for this 2024 season. I think he probably would have been a day 2 pick last year if he would have come out probably somewhere around like maybe wide receiver 7. But a lot of people going into last year thought that this was like maybe wide receiver 3, like maybe wide receiver 4, right behind like Malik Neighbors and Marvin Harrison. So it'll be interesting to see if with a healthier season, he can kind of reassert himself in a slightly weaker, maybe significantly weaker wide receiver class and be a first round pick for a team next year.
Yeah, I don't know what you think about this comparison, but even though he's a little denser than this player, the name that kind of kept coming up for me was Jordan Addison.
Interesting.
I think he's a really, really nice route runner. He's super intelligent
Mhm.
and sitting down in zones. I think he's got the quickness to beat a lot of man coverage, but not necessarily like the long speed. I like him maybe a little bit more out of the slot than outside. And so like super valuable, likes him a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know that, he is a guy who's going to ascend into like a top 10 draft pick. I think maybe he's more comfortably in that mid to late first round when all things are said and done.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Robert Woods is the name that kind
Oh
of
yeah.
was in my head when I was watching him last year. But don't hold me to that because it's been a long time since I've seen this. And like, but probably not a guy that you want to be your wide receiver 1, but could be really, really valuable as kind of that second option in an offense. So will be interesting to see what Ibuka does and what the Ohio State offense looks like with some turnover there and some change as well. But who else we need to highlight here on the offensive side of the ball, Andrew?
I'll just say this really quick. Wide receiver, I'm gonna butcher this first name. I gotta look up how to pronounce this. Tataroa McMillan out of Arizona. Big guy, really, really productive, fun. I get worried about the long speed there.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know if he's a contested catch guy, which oftentimes doesn't turn out the best in the NFL. If he can show that he's got a little bit more juice, this is a guy who could be a very elite prospect because he's good at going and getting the ball. He's physical. He's big. I think listed in the 6'4", 6'5" range. So like he's a guy that I think could really, really turn into something special in a high draft pick. But I think he's got to prove that he's more than just a contested catcher.
Yeah, you'll see on this list if you're watching on the YouTube version that we have Colson Loveland as the only tight end on this list. I think that kind of speaks to what we don't know, and that's not
Yeah.
super atypical of a tight end position. Like a lot of those guys kind of rise through the process of their last season, so we don't really know maybe who those tight end prospects are going to be. But Loveland's a guy that it's kind of hard to know like what he's going to end up being because again of the Michigan offense and maybe how few opportunities that he got. But there were flashes where you could get pretty excited about what Loveland could be. So again, another player that 2024 is going to tell us a lot about what his spring is going to look like next year.
Yeah, and 2 years ago with that historic draft class, you didn't necessarily like you knew Sam Laporta was going to be a high pick, but Dalton Kincaid came not out of nowhere, but like
Yeah.
he really progressed through the draft process and the season. Luke Musgrave, same thing, and a lot of those tight ends ascended, and so I think Loveland's got an opportunity to do that. Pro style offense, tight end, sign me up for that. So
Mm-hmm.
if he can show some production at Michigan, I think that could be really fun as well. And then we are transitioning over to some offensive linemen. I'm just going to mention these players. So we have a couple offensive tackles from LSU, Will Campbell and Emory Jones. We have Texas's Kelvin Banks Jr. and then Josh Simmons from Ohio State. So they're all listed at tackle. I don't want to dive into individual player profiles. And honestly, we're not going to do legwork on offensive linemen at this point in the offseason, but just wanted to mention these because typically what you see in mock drafts early on are really big physical athletic freaks. And when the draft rolls around, typically the tackles that are going to go high are really big athletic freaks at tackle. And so I think that probably you will see 2 to 3 names from this list that end up being really high draft picks this offseason, and 1 or 2 that maybe don't, because it's super hard to gauge. Players can have down years and really drop out of our draft projections at offensive line. So just some names to watch out for, and wanted to make sure that people were aware of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, coming from the big programs, that's exactly what you'd expect. Like, these are the guys that are going to headline the position. You'll have the guys that rise through the process later that we find out, like, okay, like small school, really talented prospect, but these are the guys certainly at the top of the list. But prototypes, right? Like Will Campbell, Emory Jones, both 6'6", 315, 320 pounds. So will be interesting to see if they can cement themselves as the top guys, because the NFL is hungry for offensive tackles, and doesn't matter how good the class is, they're just going to keep coming back to the well. So it'll be interesting to see if this class ends up being really talented, because the NFL needs them.
Absolutely. So I think it's time to wrap things up.
Yeah, so we're actually really excited to tell you about what's coming in the weeks ahead. Our vision for the Draft Fellows was never simply for me and Andrew to dominate the content. We wanted to invite some of the best minds and voices that cover the draft to be a part of the conversations with us. And so we have some phenomenal guests lined up for you over the next month or so. And so we're going to be inviting them to join us in those conversations. We're excited that our first guest is a great one. We'll be hosting Ian Cummings of Pro Football Network next week. Ian has been with PFN since 2019. He's their lead draft analyst and editor. And if you've read any of Ian's articles or heard him over on the PFN Scouting Podcast, you know that his content is absolute gold if you are a nerd and you are into this stuff like Andrew and I are. So make sure you tune in next week for our conversation with Ian. But until then, thanks for joining us. Make sure you like and subscribe to the show. Make sure you share us with a friend. From the draft room to the gridiron, the Draft Fellows have you covered. Until next time, stay tuned and stay in the game.